The year is 1951, and naval aviation is bleeding. The Royal Navy has lost 43 aircraft in 12 months, 43 machines destroyed, 43 pilots killed or maimed, 43 families receiving telegrams with regrets. Across the Atlantic, the numbers are even more staggering. The U.S. Navy records over 700 carrier accidents in the same period. Not 700 close calls or minor incidents, but 700 catastrophic failures resulting in destroyed aircraft, severe injuries, and deaths. Young men, trained at enormous expense, skilled beyond measure, courageous to the point of recklessness, are dying not in combat with enemy fighters, not from anti-aircraft fire, not even from the inherent dangers of flying experimental machines. They are dying on their own decks, killed by the very ships designed to keep them safe. The statistics are damning, but they tell only part of the story. Behind each number is a ready room that falls silent when a pilot doesn't return. Behind each accident report is a widow receiving a folded flag, children who will grow up without fathers, parents who will bury their sons. The naval aviator community is small, tight-knit, and it is hemorrhaging. Squadrons are losing pilots faster than training commands can replace them. Some carrier air groups are operating at 60% strength, not from combat losses, but from training and landing accidents. The pipeline of young men willing to accept these odds is beginning to dry up. Word spreads quickly among aviation cadets. Carrier duty in 1951 is a death sentence. The culprit is speed. More specifically, the culprit is the combination of speed and physics that makes jet aircraft fundamentally incompatible with the carrier designs inherited from World War II. Jets have made carrier operations almost suicidal, and everyone in naval aviation knows it. The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving. Consider the difference. A propeller-driven F-4U Corsair, the fighter that dominated Pacific carrier operations in 1945, approaches the deck at a stately 80 knots. Its massive propeller and piston engine provide instant throttle response. Push the throttle forward and you get immediate power. Pull it back and the engine responds within a fraction of a second. A pilot flying a Corsair has time to see, think, and react. If the landing signal officer waves him off, he has 3 or 4 seconds to apply power and climb away. If he's coming in too fast, he can reduce power and the aircraft responds immediately. If he's drifting left or right, small corrections with the stick produce immediate results. The Corsair is forgiving. It gives pilots options. Now consider the F-9F Panther jet, standard equipment on American carriers in 1951. It screams toward the deck at 120 knots, 50% faster than the Corsair. But speed is only part of the problem. The real killer is throttle response time. A jet engine doesn't have a propeller connected directly to the power plant. Instead, it has turbines that must spool up or down, and this process takes time, precious, deadly time. From idle to full power, a Panther's engine requires 8 full seconds to develop maximum thrust. 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, at 120 knots, an aircraft travels nearly half a mile. 8 seconds in which physics has already decided your fate, in which no amount of skill or courage can change the outcome. Miss the arresting wires and there is no time to think, no time to add power, no time to climb. Only the steel barricade ahead, designed to catch you, designed to crumple your aircraft into a controlled wreck, designed to maybe let you walk away from the twisted metal and leaking fuel. Maybe. USS Boxer operating off Korea in early 1951. 22 barrier crashes in 6 months. 22 times pilots missed the wires and slammed into the barricade at 100+ knots. 22 times aircraft folded like aluminum cans, cockpits compressed, fuel tanks ruptured. 14 pilots walked away. 8 did not. USS Princeton operating in the same theater. 34 accidents in 8 months, 11 fatalities. These are not experimental aircraft flown by inexperienced pilots. These are frontline fleet carriers with combat veterans at the controls, men who survived World War II, who logged hundreds of carrier landings in Corsairs and Hellcats, who know exactly what they're doing. It doesn't matter. The jets are too fast, the throttle's too slow, the margins too thin. The barricades themselves become weapons, instruments of survival transformed into agents of death. They are made of heavy nylon webbing strung between stanchions, designed to catch an aircraft that misses the arresting wires and prevent it from crashing into the aircraft parked forward on the deck. In the propeller era, they worked reasonably well. A Corsair hitting the barricade at 80 knots would usually stop without catastrophic damage, but jets hit at 120 knots, sometimes faster, and the physics are unforgiving. The barricade doesn't gently cradle the aircraft. It tears into it. Wings shear off. Fuselages crumple. The deceleration forces are enormous, 20 Gs or more in some cases. Pilots suffer broken backs, crushed ribs, internal injuries, and then there's the fire. Jet fuel is volatile, and ruptured fuel tanks ignite easily. More than one pilot has survived the initial impact only to burn to death trapped in the wreckage while deck crews fight desperately to extinguish the flames. In ready rooms across both navies, men calculate their odds in whispers. Some put them at 50-50, a coin flip whether you'll survive your tour. Some estimate worse. The truly superstitious pilots carry good luck charms, make peace with God before every flight, write letters to loved ones and leave them in their lockers just in case. The less superstitious ones simply do the math. If the average squadron makes 300 carrier landings during a 6-month deployment, and the accident rate is running at 5%, that's 15 crashes. If a third of those are fatal, that's 5 dead pilots per squadron per deployment. With 12 pilots in a typical squadron, the odds of making it through a full tour without at least witnessing a fatal accident are effectively zero. The odds of being that accident yourself are uncomfortably high. Everyone can see the mathematics of disaster. A straight flight deck, the standard configuration inherited from World War II and enshrined in decades of doctrine, offers exactly one outcome for a missed approach: collision. With propeller aircraft, this was manageable because missed approaches, called bolters in naval aviation parlance, were relatively rare. Skilled pilots could judge their approach, make fine adjustments, and catch a wire the vast majority of the time. But jets are different. Jets bolter constantly. The higher approach speed reduces the margin for error. The slower throttle response makes corrections difficult. The deck is pitching and rolling just as it always has, but now pilots have less time to compensate for that movement. Bolters that were occasional in the propeller era become routine with jets, and every bolter is a potential fatality. The equation is simple and terrible. More speed plus no margin for error equals death. Innovation tries to answer. Both the British and American navies recognize the crisis and throw resources at solving it. But the solutions all share a common flaw. They address symptoms rather than causes. The British develop the flex deck, an ambitious concept involving a rubberized landing surface meant to catch aircraft without hooks, like a giant mattress. The theory is sound. If aircraft can land without arresting gear, they won't bolter. Tests begin in 1951 with small aircraft. They fail spectacularly. Aircraft don't sink gently into the rubberized surface. They bounce like stones skipping on water, often bouncing right off the deck and into the sea. The rubber can't be made soft enough to absorb the energy without being so soft that aircraft sink completely and can't taxi. The project is quietly abandoned after 6 months and millions of pounds in development costs. The Americans try a different approach: better barricades. If pilots are going to hit the barricade, make the barricade safer. They engineer the Davis barrier. Stronger nylon, better shock absorption, improved stanchions that can flex to dissipate energy. It's an improvement. Some crashes that would have been fatal become survivable. Some pilots walk away from accidents that would have killed them with the old barricades. But the fundamental problem remains. Aircraft are still crashing, pilots are still being injured, and some still die. A softer barricade doesn't change the fact that hitting any barricade at 120 knots is a violent, dangerous event. They strengthen the barriers further, add more layers of webbing, improve the shock-absorbing systems. Men still die. These are solutions to symptoms. No one questions the fundamental geometry. the sacred layout inherited from the piston era and codified in regulations written when the fastest carrier aircraft barely exceeded 200 miles per hour. The standard configuration is simple: a straight deck running the length of the ship, with the landing area pointing directly at the aircraft parked forward. Aircraft approach from astern, catch an arresting wire, stop, and taxi forward to join the other aircraft spotted on the bow. It's efficient, it makes sense given the constraints of shipboard space, and it has always worked this way. Maritime aviation law enshrines this configuration. Engineering textbooks assume it. Training manuals teach it. To question this fundamental layout is to question nearly 30 years of carrier aviation doctrine. Captain William Rasher, operations officer on USS Midway and a decorated World War II veteran, sees the problem clearly. In February 1951, he writes an internal memo to his commanding officer that becomes semi-famous within naval aviation circles, though it never reaches beyond them. "We're landing 1952 aircraft on 1942 ships," he writes. "The doctrine doesn't fit the machine. We have adapted our procedures, improved our training, strengthened our barricades, but none of this addresses the core incompatibility. Jet aircraft need longer runways, more time to spool up engines, and room to go around if they miss the wires. Our current configuration provides none of these things. We are trying to force new aircraft into an old paradigm, and pilots are paying the price with their lives." The memo circulates among senior officers. Some agree with the assessment. A few even forward it up the chain of command. Nothing changes. The funerals continue. And in Portsmouth, England, Dennis Campbell attends another one. Dennis Campbell is not an engineer. He doesn't have a degree in aeronautical science, doesn't work in a design bureau, has never calculated a stress load or drawn up blueprints for a carrier modification. He is a 43-year-old naval bureaucrat at the Ministry of Supply, a veteran swordfish pilot who flew from carriers when engines were reliable and approaches were slow, when landing on a pitching deck was thrilling but rarely fatal. During World War II, he made dozens of carrier landings flying obsolete biplanes off HMS Illustrious and HMS Victorious, hunting submarines in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. He knew fear then, knew it intimately. But it was a different kind of fear. The fear that the enemy would find you, that your aircraft would fail over open ocean, that you'd be shot down behind enemy lines. It wasn't the fear that your own ship would kill you. Now he works in procurement and administration, managing contracts and coordinating with manufacturers, attending meetings about production schedules and delivery dates. It's important work, but far from exciting. The closest he comes to operational flying is reading accident reports and attending funerals. And God, there are so many funerals. April 1951. St. Martin's Church, Portsmouth. Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, age 26, killed in a barrier crash aboard HMS Illustrious 3 days earlier. Campbell stands in the back pew, wearing his dress uniform, watching as Lithgow's mother, a small woman with gray hair and eyes hollowed by grief, receives the folded flag from the commanding officer. He has stood here before, in this same church or others like it. He will stand here again unless something changes. Lithgow was engaged to be married. The wedding was planned for June. His fiancée sits in the front row, veiled in black, motionless. Campbell watches her shoulders shake with silent sobs and feels something break inside his chest. This is wrong. Not tragic in the way war is tragic, not the unavoidable cost of defending the nation, but wrong in a fundamental way that gnaws at him. These men aren't dying fighting the enemy. They're dying fighting physics in machines that demand more than the ships can give. Walking out into the gray Portsmouth afternoon, Campbell makes a private vow: find a way. He doesn't know what that means yet. He's not an engineer, not a designer, but he flew from carriers, knows what it feels like to approach that pitching deck, knows the terror of realizing you're coming in too hot or too low and there's no time to correct. He understands the problem in a way that engineers who've never landed on a carrier cannot. There has to be an answer. Someone has to find it. Maybe that someone is him. 6 weeks later, on a train from Portsmouth to London, Campbell stares out the window at the English countryside blurring past at 60 miles per hour. He's heading to a meeting at the ministry. something about production delays on jet fighters, nothing related to carrier operations. His mind keeps returning to the same question, the same impossible problem. What if a pilot didn't have to stop? What if missing the wires wasn't a death sentence? The question seems naive, almost childish. Of course pilots have to stop. That's how carrier landings work. You catch a wire, you stop, you taxi forward. That's the entire system. But what if it wasn't? The train tracks curve away from a station, the rails bending in a gentle arc, not head-on into the station building, but angled away from it. And suddenly, Campbell sees it. Not a complete answer, not a fully formed solution, but a possibility. A question that leads to other questions. What if the landing area didn't point at the parked aircraft? What if it was angled away? What if pilots approached at an angle, and if they missed the wires, they could just keep going, fly off the angled deck, over open water, go around for another try? He opens his briefcase with trembling hands, pulls out a piece of paper and a pen, draws a rectangle to represent the flight deck viewed from above. Then, hesitantly, as if the very act is heretical, he draws a diagonal line across it, 10 degrees off the ship's center line, an angled landing area that doesn't point at the parked aircraft forward. Pilots approach along this angled line. If they catch a wire, they stop and taxi to the parking area. If they miss the wires, if they bolter, they add power and simply fly off the angled deck, out over empty ocean. Then they climb, come around, and try again. Cut and climb. The simplest possible solution, born of desperation and grief and a train ride through the English countryside. He stares at the sketch. It looks absurd. It looks obvious. It looks like something an engineer would laugh at. It looks like the only answer that matters. For the first time in months, Campbell feels something like hope. Maybe this is it. Maybe this simple diagonal line, this tiny violation of sacred geometry, is the answer. Or maybe he's lost his mind and is about to embarrass himself in front of the entire British naval aviation establishment. Only one way to find out. August 1951. The Ministry of Supply conference room fills with experts. Aeronautical engineers from R.A. Farnborough, carrier designers from the Admiralty, senior naval officers with decades of experience, procurement specialists, and various other people who have every reason to believe they know more about carrier operations than a middle-aged bureaucrat with a sketch. Campbell stands at the front of the room with his drawing pinned to a board, feeling like a schoolboy about to present a book report. He has been given 15 minutes to present his idea, 15 minutes to convince these men to overturn 30 years of doctrine. He suspects he'll be laughed out of the room in 5. He explains his concept, keeping his voice steady through force of will. Angle the landing area 10 degrees off the ship's center line. Pilots approach at an angle rather than straight along the deck. If they catch a wire, operations proceed normally. If they miss the wires, if they bolter, they don't hit a barricade. Instead, they fly off the angled deck over open water and go around for another try. Simple, safe, obvious. No more barrier crashes. No more dead pilots. Just give them room to miss. The room erupts before he finishes his explanation. Aerodynamically unsound, declares an engineer from Farnborough, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has calculated lift coefficients. The crosswind component will push aircraft off deck before they can touch down. You're asking pilots to land with a quartering wind, which every training manual explicitly warns against. Another voice cuts in. It violates every principle of maritime aviation. The landing area has always been aligned with the ship's center line for a reason. It provides the longest possible landing area and keeps aircraft away from the ship's island superstructure. A senior naval officer, a captain who commanded carriers in the Pacific, speaks with exasperation. This is illegal under current naval air regulations. Regulation 47B explicitly requires that the landing area be aligned with the ship's center line, plus or minus 2 degrees. What you're proposing would require rewriting decades of carefully developed safety regulations. Another engineer, shaking his head, the parking geometry won't work. You'll have aircraft angled across the deck blocking the landing area. There's not enough room. Senior engineers cite textbooks, regulations, decades of doctrine, precedent, common sense. One officer, a rear admiral who clearly feels this meeting is wasting his time, calls it amateur hour and suggests Campbell stick to procurement contracts. The objections come fast and overlapping, building on each other, creating a wall of expert opinion that says, "This will not work, cannot work, has never been considered because it fundamentally misunderstands how carriers operate." Campbell stands silent, waiting for the storm to pass, feeling his face flush with embarrassment but refusing to back down. He expected this. He's not surprised. These are smart people, experienced people, and they've all been trained to think inside a very specific box. The idea of fundamentally changing the geometry of the flight deck is so far outside that box that it seems ridiculous. But he flew from carriers. He knows what it feels like to bolter and see the barricade rushing toward you and know you have 3 seconds to live. These engineers don't know that feeling. They can calculate stresses and aerodynamic forces, but they don't know what it means to die from geometry. Then Lewis Boddington speaks. Boddington is a civilian engineer from R.A. Farnborough, one of the most respected aerodynamics experts in Britain, a man whose opinion carries weight. He's been sitting quietly through the barrage of objections, fingers steepled, expression neutral. Now he leans forward and speaks calmly. "Gentlemen, show me the math." The room quiets. People look at each other. Boddington continues, his voice mild but insistent. "Show me the calculations proving this won't work. You've all cited principles and regulations and precedent, but has anyone actually calculated whether the crosswind effect would be unmanageable? Has anyone modeled whether pilots could compensate for a 10-degree angle on approach? Has anyone determined whether the parking geometry is actually impossible?" He looks around the room. Captain Campbell has proposed an idea that might save lives. Before we dismiss it, shouldn't we at least run the numbers? Silence. Because the answer is obvious, no one has run the numbers. No one has tried. The idea is too far outside doctrine to merit calculation. It's been dismissed on principle before anyone bothered with mathematics. That's not how innovation is supposed to work, but that's how it happens in large bureaucracies. Ideas that challenge fundamental assumptions get killed before they reach the testing stage. Boddington turns to Campbell. "Paint it on a deck. Let's see what happens. HMS Triumph is due for refit next month. Before she goes into the yards, let's paint an angled landing area on her deck. Just paint, no modifications, no construction. Then let's send pilots up to simulate landing approaches and see if your predicted problems actually materialize. If the crosswinds are unmanageable, if pilots can't adapt to the geometry, if it's as impossible as everyone claims, the paint washes off and we've lost nothing but a few days. But if it works..." He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. 3 days later, after rapid consultations up the chain of command and a surprising amount of resistance from people who believe even testing the idea is a waste of resources, HMS Triumph receives authorization for painted deck trials. No modifications, no construction, just paint, yellow lines marking where an angled deck would be. The trials are scheduled for 3 weeks in September. Pilots will simulate landing approaches over the painted lines and report whether Campbell's theory holds or whether it's as impractical as the experts predict. September 1951. HMS Triumph departs Portsmouth Harbor with a yellow diagonal painted across her flight deck, 10 degrees off the ship's center line. The paint job took 8 hours and less than $50 in materials. Pilots call it the Crazy Stripe and Campbell's Folly. They're going to simulate landings over it for 3 weeks, then report whether this bizarre experiment has any merit or whether it's just another failed idea in a long history of failed ideas. The experts who attended the briefing have already prepared to write "I told you so" reports. Several have bet money the trials will be canceled within a week after someone nearly crashes. The experts predict disaster, and they explain their predictions in meticulous detail to anyone who will listen. Crosswinds will push aircraft sideways off the angled approach. The geometry creates a quartering wind that will make it impossible to maintain the correct lineup. Pilots won't be able to adapt to the new geometry. They've trained for years to approach along the ship's center line, and muscle memory will make the angled approach feel unnatural and dangerous. The painted area is too narrow. Approaching at an angle effectively reduces the usable width of the landing area. which is already barely adequate. Every briefing includes caveats, warnings, abort procedures, contingency plans for when the inevitable near disaster occurs. On the first approach, Lieutenant Peter Chilton lines up his Sea Fury propeller-driven fighter over the yellow stripe. He's a combat veteran with 200 carrier landings in his logbook, and he's deeply skeptical of this entire exercise. Wind from starboard. Exactly the condition engineers warned about. He feels the push, the aircraft drifting left as the crosswind hits his right side. For a moment, he thinks the experts were right. This isn't going to work. Then, his hands move automatically, years of training taking over. Slight right rudder, a touch of right aileron. The corrections feel normal, natural. He's compensated for quartering winds 1,000 times before. This is no different. He crosses the painted threshold. Touches down. His tailhook drags across the deck, missing the imaginary arresting wires, a simulated bolter, and discovers he has room. Open deck stretches ahead, angled away from the parked aircraft. In a real landing, he would add power now, would feel the engine spool up, would lift off and climb away. He could live. For the first time in years of jet carrier operations looming in his future, the simple realization washes over him. He could miss the wires and live. After landing, Chilton climbs out of his cockpit, removes his helmet, and walks across the deck to where Campbell and several observers are standing. His hands are steady when he fills out the debrief form. His handwriting is clear and precise. Under the section marked Comments, he writes, "For the first time, I wasn't terrified. I could miss the wires and live. The crosswind was manageable. No more difficult than compensating for deck motion, which we do on every approach anyway. The angled geometry felt strange for the first 30 seconds, then normal. Request permission to continue trials with full enthusiasm." Over 3 weeks, 89 pilots from various squadrons and various experience levels make 1,146 simulated angled approaches in multiple aircraft types. Sea Furies, Sea Vampires, even a few experimental jet types. They fly in different weather conditions, different times of day, different wind speeds and directions. The predicted crosswind drift doesn't materialize. Pilots compensate naturally, making small corrections just as they've always made small corrections for carrier pitch and roll and wind. The angled geometry that engineers claimed would be impossible to master becomes routine within a few approaches. One pilot reports that by his third approach, he wasn't even thinking about the angle anymore. It just felt like a normal carrier landing. What does materialize is something unexpected, something no one predicted. Confidence, freedom. Psychological relief so profound that it shows up in measurable ways. Pilots discover that when death is not the only outcome of missing the wires, their performance improves across the board. Approach speeds become more stable. Pilots aren't subconsciously speeding up to avoid boltering. Landing accuracy increases. Without the fear of the barricade ahead, pilots can focus on proper technique rather than desperation. Wave-offs and go-arounds become routine rather than emergency procedures. Fear, it turns out, is terrible for precision. Remove the fear and precision improves. The final report lands on Boddington's desk in October. It's compiled by 3 different test pilots, cross-checked by engineers, reviewed by the Triumph's commanding officer. The conclusion is 3 words. It works perfectly. But the report goes much further. It includes statistical analysis showing improved landing accuracy, pilot testimonials describing the psychological impact, and engineering data confirming that the crosswind effects are manageable. It includes photographs of the painted deck from various angles, diagrams showing how the parking geometry can be adapted, and recommendations for how to implement the system on operational carriers. The experts who predicted disaster are forced to revise their opinions. Some do so gracefully, admitting they were wrong to dismiss the idea without testing. Others remain skeptical, arguing that paint trials with propeller aircraft don't prove the concept will work with fast jets under combat conditions. But the data is compelling. The system works. Now the question is whether the Americans will believe it. September 1951. While HMS Triumph conducts painted deck trials in British waters, Captain Dennis Campbell makes preparations for the next phase. If the angled deck is going to become standard on all carriers worldwide, it needs American buy-in. The United States operates the largest carrier fleet in the world, and American naval doctrine drives global standards. If the U.S. Navy rejects the angled deck, it will remain a British curiosity. If the U.S. Navy adopts it, it will become universal. Campbell cannot personally travel to America. He's needed in Portsmouth and doesn't have the bureaucratic authority to speak for the Royal Navy. Instead, he gives his sketch and the preliminary trial data to the best possible messenger, British test pilot Eric Winkle Brown. Brown is a legend. At age 32, he holds the record for more carrier landings than any pilot in history, nearly 2,000 in his logbook, across dozens of different aircraft types and multiple carriers. He's landed everything from Spitfires to jets on British carriers, and he's familiar with American operations after serving as an exchange pilot with the U.S. Navy during World War II. More importantly, he's respected on both sides of the Atlantic. When Winkle Brown says something about carrier operations, people listen. In September 1951, Brown flies to Maryland carrying Campbell's sketch, the Triumph trial data, and a mission to convince the Americans that a 10-degree line can save thousands of lives. The U.S. Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River sits on the western shore of Chesapeake Bay, home to the Navy's best test pilots and most advanced experimental aircraft. It's where new carrier aircraft are evaluated, where landing techniques are developed, where the future of naval aviation is quite literally drawn on chalkboards and tested in the sky. When Winkle Brown arrives in September 1951, he finds a community that is painfully aware of the crisis in carrier jet operations. They've lost pilots. They've analyzed the statistics. They know something needs to change. But the American approach to the problem has focused on incremental improvements. Better barricades, improved training, modified approach procedures. The idea of fundamentally redesigning the flight deck geometry seems radical, possibly reckless. Brown requests a briefing with senior leadership. He gets it, but the room that gathers in the Patuxent River Conference Room is skeptical. Commander Harold Buell, a Pacific War veteran with the 150 combat missions and deep experience in carrier operations, looks at Campbell's sketch and sees heresy. "You're suggesting we redesign every carrier in the fleet based on a British theory? A line on paper?" His tone makes clear what he thinks of the idea. Brown doesn't flinch. He's been in enough briefing rooms, faced enough skepticism to know that this moment requires clarity and force. "I'm suggesting you stop killing pilots based on 1942 thinking." The room tenses. Several officers shift in their seats. This is not how junior officers typically speak to commanders. But Brown isn't a junior officer. He's a decorated test pilot speaking truth about a crisis everyone in the room knows is real. Rear Admiral Alfred Pride intervenes before the confrontation can escalate. "Explain." 2 words spoken calmly, giving Brown the floor. Brown does exactly what Campbell did in Portsmouth 3 months earlier. He explains the concept clearly, without jargon, without appeals to authority. He draws the angled deck on a chalkboard, shows how pilots approach at an angle, shows how bolters fly off into empty ocean rather than into barricades, shows how the parking geometry can be adapted to accommodate the new layout. No jargon, no theory, just the raw arithmetic of jet operations. Higher speeds, longer spool-up times, barrier failures. The same crisis the Americans are facing, the same coffins. Then Brown plays his strongest card, data from HMS Triumph. He spreads photographs and reports across the conference table. 89 pilots, 146 approaches. No accidents, improved landing accuracy, pilot testimonials describing psychological relief, engineering data confirming manageable crosswinds. This isn't theory anymore. It's tested reality. The angled deck offers pilots what they don't have now. A second chance. Not a maybe, not a hope. A proven, demonstrated, measurable second chance. The room falls silent as officers examine the data. Some remain skeptical. Some see immediately what this could mean. Admiral Apollo Suchek, Chief of Naval Air Training, studies the photographs for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looks up at Brown and speaks. "We'll test it. Paint a deck on Midway. 60 days. If it fails, we bury it and never speak of this again. If it works. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. Everyone in the room understands what he means. If it works, everything changes. Authorization is granted that afternoon. USS Midway, one of America's largest carriers, will conduct full-scale trials at Guantanamo Bay starting January 1953. The delay is necessary. Midway is currently deployed, and scheduling a 60-day trial period requires coordination across multiple commands. But the authorization is real, and suddenly what seemed like a British eccentricity becomes an American priority. Word spreads quickly through the naval aviation community. Patuxent River is testing the angled deck. The crazy British idea might actually work. January 12, 1953. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The morning breaks clear and hot, temperature already climbing toward 85 degrees at 0800. USS Antietam sits at anchor in the bay, her flight deck freshly painted with an 8-degree angled landing area. Slightly less angle than Campbell's original 10 degrees, adjusted based on American carrier dimensions and parking requirements. She's the first American carrier to test this concept under real conditions, with real jets, real pilots, and real consequences if something goes wrong. The entire enterprise feels impossibly fragile. One accident, one pilot pushed off deck by crosswinds, one disaster, and the program dies. The skeptics are watching carefully, waiting to say, "I told you so." Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell, the same officer who called the concept heresy 16 months ago, the same man who looked at Campbell's sketch with contempt, volunteers to make the first angled deck landing. He's not a convert necessarily, but he's a professional. If the Navy is testing this system, someone needs to fly it properly, and Buell is one of the best carrier pilots in the fleet. He's been briefed extensively, has studied the British trial data, has even spoken with Winkle Brown by phone. He understands the theory. Whether it will work with a Panther jet at 120 knots under real conditions remains to be seen. He's flying an F-9F Panther, the same type of jet that's been involved in dozens of barrier crashes. The stakes are silent but absolute. If this first landing fails catastrophically, the program ends. If it succeeds, if Buell can demonstrate that the system works with fast jets, everything changes. No pressure. Buell's approach is textbook. He's flown 300 carrier landings in his career, and his hands know what to do without conscious thought. Lined up on the angled stripe painted in white across Antietam's deck. On speed, checking his airspeed indicator, holding exactly 120 knots. On glide slope, watching the Fresnel lens optical landing system, keeping the glowing ball centered. The carrier is steaming into the wind, giving him 30 knots of wind over the deck, reducing his closure rate. Everything is routine. Everything is normal, except for the angle. Except for the fact that he's approaching 8 degrees off center line, something every instinct and every hour of training says is wrong. He crosses the ramp, the stern of the ship passing beneath him. His tailhook drops, the device that will hopefully catch one of 4 arresting wires stretched across the deck. Touchdown. Tires hit the deck hard. His tailhook hits the deck harder, bouncing once and misses all 4 wires. Bolter. In the old geometry, this is catastrophe. Barrier ahead. Steel webbing strung between stanchions. Impact in 3 seconds. Steel and fuel and failure and possibly fire. But Antietam's deck is angled. Open water stretches ahead, out over the port side of the ship. Buell's hands move automatically. A practiced response that's been drilled into every carrier pilot. Bolter pattern. Throttle forward. Stick back slightly. Now comes the test. Will the Panther's engine spool up fast enough? Will he have enough distance? The engine spools, slowly, painfully, each second feeling like an hour. The jet howls. Deck passes beneath him. 30 feet left. The nose starts to rise. 60 feet. The engine catches full power. He climbs. He goes around. Enters the pattern. Lines up again. Makes another approach. This time his tailhook catches the number 3 wire. Perfect landing. He taxis forward and shuts down the engine. After touchdown, Buell sits in the cockpit for a full minute, not moving, just breathing. The realization washes over him slowly. He just bolted without dying. He just missed the wires and flew away, as casually as waving off from a land runway. Later, he'll write in his report, "The world's first bolter that didn't try to kill me." Over the next 60 days, January through March 1953, USS Antietam conducts the most intensive carrier landing trials in naval aviation history. Multiple pilots, multiple aircraft types, multiple weather conditions, day landings, night landings, crosswind landings, rough seas with the deck pitching and rolling, emergency low fuel approaches, every conceivable scenario that operational carriers face in the real world. The statistics are meticulously recorded. 1,327 landings total. 187 bolters, meaning 187 times pilots missed all the wires and had to go around. 0 barrier crashes, 0 fatalities, 0 aircraft destroyed. When pilots bolter, miss the wires, they add power and climb away as casually as waving off from a land runway. The fear drains out of the ready room. Pilots start requesting carrier duty again. Statistics confirm what pilots feel viscerally. 75% reduction in landing accidents within the trial period. The math is clear and compelling. Of the 187 bolters during the Antietam trials, historical data suggests that at least 50 would have resulted in barrier crashes using the old straight-deck configuration. Of those 50 barrier crashes, at least 15 would have been fatal. Instead, 0 crashes, 0 fatalities. Extrapolated across the fleet over 3 years, the numbers predict 80% fewer fatalities. Hundreds of lives saved, thousands over decades. The skeptics run out of arguments. The data is undeniable. The system works. It works with jets. It works in bad weather. It works at night. It works when pilots are exhausted after long missions. It works because the fundamental concept is sound. Give pilots room to miss, and they'll survive to try again. The revolution is proven. Now it just needs to be built into every carrier in the world. 1955. HMS Ark Royal commissions with a fully integrated angled deck. Not painted, but structurally designed into the ship from the keel up. British carriers lead the way because British designers started first, but the Americans aren't far behind. 1956. USS Forrestal, America's first supercarrier and the largest warship ever built, is launched with an angled deck as a foundational design element. Not an afterthought, not a modification, but a core feature of the design. Secretary of the Navy, Charles Thomas, speaking at the commissioning ceremony, calls it the single greatest advance in carrier safety since the invention of the tailhook. The angled deck is now official U.S. policy. Every carrier in the fleet will be retrofitted. Every new carrier will be built with this configuration from the start. 1957. The design spreads globally. France's Clemenceau, Australia's HMS Melbourne, angled decks standard. The design spreads like a solution to a math problem everyone suddenly agrees on. Countries that operate carriers have 2 choices: adopt the angled deck or accept that their pilots will keep dying in preventable accidents. The math is simple. Every nation with carriers chooses to adopt. Even the Soviet Union, initially dismissive of Western innovations and reluctant to admit that capitalist navies have superior ideas, watches its own accident rates and reverses course. After 3 fatal barrier crashes on the carrier Varyag in 1956–1957, killing 8 pilots total, Soviet engineers swallow their pride and implement a 9-degree angled deck on all existing and planned carriers. They do not credit Campbell. They do not acknowledge that the idea came from Britain. Official Soviet documents describe the angled deck as a Soviet innovation in maritime aviation safety. But they use Campbell's line. They use his geometry, and Soviet pilots stop dying in barrier crashes. By 1975, every operational aircraft carrier in the world features an angled flight deck. British, American, French, Soviet, Australian, Canadian, Brazilian. Every nation with carriers has adopted the same fundamental geometry. The The revolution becomes invisible because it becomes standard. A generation of naval aviators grows up never knowing what it was like to land on a straight deck, never knowing that missing wires once meant death. Young pilots training for carrier duty in 1975 learn the angled deck system from day one. Their instructors teach it as if it has always been this way, as if carriers were always designed with this geometry, as if the straight deck era never existed. The design is so fundamental, so obviously correct that it seems impossible it was ever different. Aviation historians will later marvel at this fact. For 30 years, naval aviation operated with a fundamentally flawed deck configuration, and everyone accepted it as normal because everyone had always done it that way. It took a bureaucrat with no formal engineering training, motivated by grief and frustration, to question the unquestionable. And once questioned, once tested, the new configuration was adopted globally within a decade. That's how fast good ideas spread when they save lives. Dennis Campbell is promoted to Rear Admiral in 1957, a recognition of his contribution to naval aviation safety. He's appointed Commander of the British Empire, CBE, in 1960, receiving the honor at Buckingham Palace from Queen Elizabeth II herself. When reporters come to interview him about his invention, about the thousands of lives saved, about revolutionizing carrier operations, he redirects them to other people. "Talk to Louis Boddington," he says. "He's the engineer who authorized the trials. Talk to the test pilots from HMS Triumph. They're the ones who proved it worked. Talk to Winkle Brown, who convinced the Americans. I just drew a line." This becomes Campbell's standard response to questions about his legacy. I drew a line. Other men proved it worked. He refuses to take sole credit, refuses to position himself as a lone genius who solved an impossible problem. In his view, he identified a possibility. Others did the hard work of proving that possibility was real. This humility is genuine, not false modesty. Campbell spent his entire career in bureaucratic positions, coordinating other people's work, and he sees the angled deck the same way. A team effort that happened to start with his sketch. After retirement from the Royal Navy in 1963, Campbell works as a consultant for Hawker Siddeley, the British aerospace company, focusing on VSTOL, vertical, short takeoff and landing safety systems. He's in his late 50s, officially retired from active duty. But he can't stop thinking about how to keep pilots alive. His colleagues at Hawker Siddeley remember him as relentlessly focused on failure modes, constantly asking uncomfortable questions. At every design review, every testing meeting, every discussion of new aircraft or new systems, Campbell asks the same question: what happens when it fails at night in bad weather? The engineers learn to expect this question. They learn to have answers ready. But Campbell never stops asking because he knows that the difference between life and death isn't how well a system works under ideal conditions. It's how gracefully it fails under the worst possible conditions. He's still trying to save pilots, still attending to the details that separate safety from catastrophe. Some colleagues find his questions annoying, others recognize them as wisdom earned from watching too many young men die from overlooked failure modes. April 6, 2000. Dennis Campbell dies at age 92 at his home in Hampshire, England, surrounded by family. He had lived long enough to see his angled deck become universal, long enough to watch several generations of naval aviators benefit from his idea, long enough to know that his contribution mattered. The obituary in the Times runs 4 paragraphs. It mentions his naval service in World War II, his work on the angled flight deck, his later contributions to aerospace safety, and his family. The obituary mentions the angled deck briefly, among other achievements, as if it's one item in a list rather than a revolution that saved thousands of lives. There are no state funerals for bureaucrats who sketched revolutions on trains. The Navy sends a representative. A few old colleagues attend. His family grieves privately. The world continues, barely noting his passing. But across the world, carrier pilots land safely, every day, every night, in good weather and bad. Off the coast of Japan and California and Norfolk and Diego Garcia and a dozen other places where carriers operate. They bolter, add power, climb away, and try again. They do not know Campbell's name. They do not need to. His line has become their sky, the invisible architecture that keeps them alive. The modern U.S. Navy conducts approximately 15,000 carrier landings annually. Without the angled deck, historical accident rates from the early 1950s suggest that 200 to 300 of those would result in serious crashes, with 50-80 fatalities. That's per year. Multiply across decades, across all the Navy's operating carriers. Tens of thousands of lives saved by a 10-degree angle. The mathematics are staggering. In 2003, retired Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black, USMC, writes to Campbell's daughter after learning of her father's contribution to naval aviation, "Your father gave me 142 second chances. Every time I bolted and flew away, I was living on borrowed time. Time he gave me. I flew F-4 Phantoms off carriers for 15 years. I bolted 142 times. In the old configuration, at least a dozen of those would have been barrier crashes. 2 or 3 would probably have killed me. Instead, I added power and went around. I came home to my family. Your father made that possible." Some revolutions arrive with thunder, splitting atoms, breaking sound barriers, landing on the moon. Others arrive quietly, with a sketch on a briefing room wall and one man who refused to shut up. Dennis Campbell saw young men dying from geometry and dared to redraw the shape of safety itself. He wasn't a genius inventor, wasn't a brilliant engineer. He was a bureaucrat who attended too many funerals and asked a simple question: what if we just gave them room to miss? The angled flight deck is not a weapon. It never destroyed an enemy. It never won a battle. It simply allowed thousands of pilots to come home, to try again, to land again, to live again. In the arithmetic of war, that is perhaps the rarest victory, the one that counts in lives saved rather than lives taken. Campbell's line still stretches across every carrier deck in the world, angled 8 to 12 degrees off-center, painted in white or yellow, guiding pilots home. It is invisible to those who've never known the alternative. Pilots born after 1960 have never seen a straight-deck carrier except in historical photos. They learn the angled deck system as the only system, the natural system, the way carriers have always worked. They don't know about the barrier crashes, the funerals, the crisis of 1951. They don't need to know. The system works so well that its history fades into irrelevance. But it is there, constant, fundamental, life-giving. A line that changed everything by simply offering what pilots had never had before: a second chance. That's Campbell's legacy. Second chances measured in thousands. Every bolter that ends in a safe go-around rather than a barrier crash is a small miracle, a tiny echo of that train ride through England when one man dared to draw a diagonal line and imagine a better way. Some ideas save one life. Some save hundreds. This one saved thousands and continues saving lives today, invisible and essential. A revolution so successful it vanished into normalcy.